Good day. Over the course of my video yesterday, I read out a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense which confirmed the Russian capture of the town of Soledar in Donetsk region, now, according to the Russians, a part of the Russian Federation, but still claimed by Ukraine as part of its own territory. And I pointed out that one of the curiosities about this statement by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which actually went into the fighting in a great deal of detail around Soledar, is that it did not mention in any shape or form the Wagner group, whose assault forces had actually captured Soledar. They were the soldiers who actually stormed the town and did the fighting there and defeated the Ukrainian forces which were defending Soledar. And I pointed out, and lots of people have also pointed this out, that this clearly points to some degree of animus between the regular military in the Russian Ministry of Defense and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, who has, over the last couple of weeks, been an increasingly public voice, sometimes criticizing the conduct of the Russian military authorities over the course of this conflict in Ukraine. Well, unsurprisingly, there was something of an uproar in Russia about the way in which the Russian Ministry of Defense had completely ignored the contribution of the Wagner group and its fighters in the capture of Soledar. And there are some reports that Prigozhin himself actually traveled to St. Petersburg, where allegedly he met with no less a person than Putin himself and complained directly to Putin about the fact that he and his fighters and their contribution in the fighting had been ignored. That, no doubt, all of these things together, including any possible conversation between Putin and Prigozhin, has now led to the Russian Ministry of Defense later yesterday evening publishing a supplemental statement, and I'm going to read it. Due to the requests from the mass media regarding the composition and participation of various units of the Russian group of forces in the liberation of Soledar, Donetsk People's Republics, from the armed forces of Ukraine, it is necessary to clarify the following. A combined arms grouping of Russian troops carried out the offensive operation in this tactical direction that resulted in the defeat of the armed forces of Ukraine and the seizure of Soledar in accordance with a single concept and plan that stipulated a number of combat missions. These missions included, as previously reported, blocking the town from the north and south, isolating the area of operations, preventing the enemy from moving reserves into the town from neighboring areas, and preventing the withdrawal of Ukrainian army units from Soledar, as well as fire support of the offensive by ground attack, aircraft, and artillery. As for the assault on the urban areas of Soledar, occupied by the Ukrainian military, this combat mission was successfully accomplished by the courageous and selfless actions of the volunteer assault units of the Wagner private military company. I believe I am right in saying that that is the first occasion that the Wagner group has ever been mentioned or referenced in any Russian Ministry of Defense document. So, the original statement of the Ministry of Defense, which conspicuously ignored the contribution of the Wagner group in the capture of Soledar, has now been corrected. Lots of units were involved, no doubt the paratroopers, the Air Force, the artillery, the missile forces, all of them played a role. And there was, of course, a single unified concept and plan. But the assault itself, the actual capture, or if you prefer, liberation of Soledar, that was the work of the courageous and selfless volunteers of the Wagner Group. So you could say the justice has been done. Well, I don't want to overemphasize this aspect of the conflict. Anybody with even a cursory knowledge of military history, which is, by the way, all I have, will know that throughout military history there have been conflicts between commanders. It's completely unsurprising. The kind of people who rise to command positions, especially if they're effective and successful, are going to be people with enormously strong self-confidence and oversized personalities. And it's inevitable that from time to time clashes take place between them. I'm sure all of you who are watching this program, who have any knowledge of military history, could come up with any number of examples. I mean, Patton versus Montgomery is one that I think British and American viewers would be instantly familiar with, for example. So there's absolutely nothing surprising or unusual about this clash between Prigozhin and some people in the Russian regular military. And someone, and I strongly suspect, by the way, it is Putin, has now stepped in and has adjusted things, smoothed ruffled feathers, and that's also the way things should be done. Again, people who are familiar with the American Civil War, the only war I have ever studied, by the way, in any detail, will know that, again, that was something that President Lincoln regularly had to do over the course of that war when incidents arose with the commanders of the Union forces. So if this was Putin himself stepping in, as I strongly suspect it was, well, he's doing his job as the ultimate supreme commander of the Russian forces in this battle. Now, there's been a lot of comment about all of this in the Western media. There's been an extraordinary article in the Daily Telegraph about how this latest statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense represents some kind of humiliating U-turn for the Russian Ministry of Defense. I am going to say straight away that I think that kind of coverage is desperate. It is an attempt to play up what I suspect is going to be a minor quarrel of only interest to historians in the future, and to try to elevate it into some important event, just somehow suppressing the reality of the fall of Soledar. And whilst I'm talking about the fall of Soledar, well, the Russians say that Soledar essentially fell on the 9th of January and was under effective control by the Russian forces on the 10th of January, and today is the 14th of January, and the Ukrainians are continuing to insist, despite a massive accumulation of the evidence now, that Soledar is still held by their forces and that there is still some kind of a battle going on there. I'm going to say straight away that this is incredible. It is clearly not true. The Western media is trying to follow this Ukrainian line. I suspect most of them don't believe in either. In any event, it is a straightforward exercise in denial. In previous videos, I said that there were some elements of truth to this. There were no doubt some stragglers and holdouts in Soledar after the Wagner forces overran it, but I said this is of no great military significance. Well, I'm sure that to the extent that there were stragglers and holdouts in Soledar, and might be still, that has seriously diminished, and of course all of the Ukrainian counterattacks to try to retake Soledar, as I discussed in my video yesterday, have been unsuccessful. Whilst there was perhaps some case for disputing some of the Russian claims about the fall of Soledar, which were being made a few days ago, today, continuing to pretend that Ukraine still has an effective presence in Soledar is starting to look like an exercise in denial. It's not to deny that there is still fighting going on, and there's more reports. There were more reports last night and still this morning about Russian and Wagner organization troops pushing forward in places like the Sol railway station, another village, I can't remember its name, close to Soledar itself, and that they're now starting to launch attacks on Krasnaya Gora, which is, as I said, a village close to the road leading from Bakhmut to the north towards Siversk. So all that fighting is still going on, and this is, of course, in the vicinity of Soledar. But there is no doubt at all that Soledar itself is under Russian control. Now, a number of people contacted me about this and the various explanations for the Ukrainian leadership's extraordinary difficulty, both in ordering the retreat of its forces from undefendable positions like Soledar and Bakhmut, and for their inability to admit the obvious fact, the indisputable fact, that Soledar, the metropolitan area of that town, has fallen, and minus whatever holdouts that might still be there, is now under Russian control. And the point is simply this: Ukraine has sacrificed hundreds, probably thousands of soldiers trying to hold Soledar. In fact, there are photographs, there are claims that Soledar is littered with the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers, dead Ukrainian soldiers, and there are some photographs which, I'm very sorry to say, corroborate those claims. Now, Soledar is not a huge place. It's around 10,000 people, I believe, before the war. I'm not going to pretend that the photographs I've seen cover every single centimetre of the town. It could be that these bodies are concentrated in particular locations around the town, and that claims that the entire town is littered with bodies are exaggerations. I am very willing to believe that, and by the way, I earnestly hope it is true. But it is indisputable that Ukraine has taken very heavy losses in the fight for Soledar, a fight for Soledar which has been underway since August. And the fact that so many Ukrainian soldiers have died defending Soledar, and the figures that I'm hearing coming through on this are horrendous. They reach the thousands, and in some claims put it even higher, in the tens of thousands. And I'm talking now more about dead than wounded. Well, if that is true, then the inability or refusal to acknowledge that Soledar has fallen is perhaps not so difficult to understand. It must be extremely difficult for the Ukrainian leadership and for the Ukrainian military leaders to acknowledge that all this vast investment in the lives of their soldiers in defending this town has been ultimately for nothing. It has been a failure. And of course, there is a political dimension here as well, because all of those soldiers who have died or been wounded defending Soledar, have families, have friends, and of course, if they get the sense that their lives have been sacrificed in such huge numbers to no purpose, well, there could be a public reaction, and that might lead to criticism of the political and military authorities. People in Britain will in particular be very familiar with this, at least not directly, but from their history. There is a massive expenditure of young lives in the war, in the First World War in Britain, and this has led to criticism of the British commanders and the British military leadership ever since. There have been films and documentaries and books written about this. Some of these criticisms have been challenged by later historians, but they become very much part of British folklore. And it's probably fair to say that the British military leaders who led the British armies in the First World War, in the battles in which so many men lost their lives, well, their reputations have never recovered. And in Ukraine, where, to put it mildly, the political position is probably more unstable and more volatile, well, one can understand why political leaders especially, and military leaders, might be nervous about acknowledging that this huge sacrifice in Soledar overall was for nothing. And I say all of this because I've been reading a particular message, a public letter written by a very distraught Ukrainian woman about the losses of a Ukrainian military unit, the 60th Brigade, which was located apparently somewhere in the area around Soledar, and she is clearly very distraught. I'm not going to read the letter, by the way. She's clearly very distraught and very upset by what has happened. For the record, I have considered the possibility that this is a fake and that it might have been put together by someone in Russian intelligence, but I've come to the view that almost certainly it is genuine. And I suspect that the despair and dismay expressed in this letter reflects feelings of many people, many of the families of these soldiers who have either been heavily wounded or have died in Ukraine. And I'm going to say, moreover, that this letter does make criticisms of at least one prominent Ukrainian official. Interestingly, it is not President Zelensky. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny. Anyway, I think that is perhaps the single best reason why the Ukrainian leadership, is refusing to acknowledge the truth about Soledar. Doing so, admitting that the town has fallen, means confronting the anger of the possible anger of Ukrainian families and perhaps even Ukrainian soldiers who might question that enormous sacrifice that there has been in defending a town which has now been lost. And by the way, whilst I'm on that topic, one particular Ukrainian political figure, an advisor of President Zelensky, has even come forward over the last few days and said that the battle for Soledar is like the Battle of Verdun. Battle of Verdun was an enormously bloody battle during the First World War between France and Germany. It's famous for the fact that the French who fought at Verdun had this slogan about the Germans that they shall not pass. And of course, in the case of Verdun, they didn't. The Germans were stopped in what many people today acknowledge was an extremely successful, a successful defensive battle, even though the French suffered appalling casualties in defending Verdun. And by the way, on that topic, Verdun made the reputation of the French commander of the troops who were fighting there, who was, of course, none other than the man who became Marshal Pétain. But I'm not going to discuss all that in more detail. Well, I think that comparisons with Verdun are inappropriate because, as I said, Verdun was held, whereas Soledar unequivocally has been lost. So what is Ukraine going to do? Well, I'm going to make a guess, which is that they're going to probably never properly acknowledge the loss of Soledar. It is too difficult an admission to make, and quite likely we will see gradual, understated admissions of the fact, but no formal acknowledgement, no open acknowledgement, such as we saw when Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk fell. And I'm very sorry to say that I suspect that the same dynamic is now also present in the fighting in Bakhmut. Again, precisely because Ukrainian losses defending Bakhmut have been so heavy, it is going to be very difficult for Ukraine now to retreat from Bakhmut and to acknowledge the loss of Bakhmut when it comes. And I'm afraid that means that the Battle of Bakhmut is going to continue. Now, I ought to say and acknowledge again that these are points that had not initially occurred to me. They've been brought to my notice by people who've contacted me and have made these points to me. But I think that they are good and valid points, even though they are also tragic and very sad ones. So it looks like the Battle of Bakhmut is going to continue. And I would add that there are various people who consider that this is exactly what the Russians want. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, for example, in an absolutely fascinating discussion he had with Professor Vlachos a short time ago, back in December. You can find it, by the way, on there's a YouTube video of it. Colonel Macgregor, in what I thought was an extraordinarily vivid metaphor, said that Soledar was like the piece of, Bakhmut was like the trap with the cheese that the Russians had set up for the Ukrainians, drawing the Ukrainians in. The very fact that Ukraine was able to defend Bakhmut against these relentless Russian attacks meant that Ukraine continued to defend Bakhmut against these Russian attacks, so that Bakhmut started to suck in more and more Ukrainian troops, which is, from the Russian point of view, exactly what the Russians wanted. I've even seen some suggestions, which I'm not going to go along with, by the way. I think this is taking it too far. But anyway, I've even seen some suggestions that the Russians deliberately slow-walked the capture of Soledar and ultimately of Bakhmut in order to continue to attract into Bakhmut more and more Ukrainian soldiers so that they could be destroyed there. I think, as I said, that's probably too sophisticated, but there it is. The very fact that people are talking in that way tells us a little bit about the nature of the battle that's been played out there and the way that the Russians have conducted it. On the topic of Bakhmut, let me reiterate again, and there's been more statements from Russian officials about this over the course of the last few hours. The position of the Ukrainian forces who are defending Bakhmut is now becoming increasingly critical. The Russians now control two of the big roads into Bakhmut, the ones from the south that pass through Opitnoye, which is now confirmed by the Russians as captured and under their control, and the roads that entered Bakhmut, obviously, from the east. And they're soon, very soon, going to cut the roads leading into Bakhmut from the north, the roads leading all the way to Siversk. So that is only going to leave one remaining road, the one that passes through Ivanovka and enters Bakhmut from the west. And that road is already being shelled routinely now by Russian artillery, making the movement of men and supplies into and out of Bakhmut along that road increasingly problematic. It can be done, apparently, but losses, there are inevitable losses, and I get to make a guess that these troops these supplies, if they enter Bakhmut along that road, they have to be moved. They have to move extremely fast in order to avoid the shelling of the Russian guns. And I'm also going to make a guess that a lot of this movement now has to take place at night. So the Ukrainians can still use this road, but it's becoming dangerous and difficult to do so. And with the Russians in control of Opitnoye and now attacking Klesheyevka, this village that I have great difficulty knowing exactly how to pronounce, and my apologies for that, by the way. It seems to me that an outright attack on Ivanovka is only a matter of time now, and if Ivanovka is captured by the Russians and the road leading through Ivanovka into Bakhmut is also cut, then any Ukrainian troops still in Bakhmut, allegedly 2 brigades at the present time, that would be about, I'm guessing, around 8,000 men, assuming those brigades are up to strength, which they probably aren't. But anyway, any Ukrainian troops still in Bakhmut would be trapped in what the Russians call a cauldron, and they would experience the same disaster as the Ukrainian troops who were defending Soledar have just experienced. So that seems to me the position. And I would add, by the way, that whilst the Ukrainians can, to a certain extent, no doubt, continue the fiction, at least for a while, that Soledar is being successfully defended, Bakhmut being a bigger place, that will be more difficult to do. Though again, I expect that if or when rather than if, Bakhmut does indeed fall, the Ukrainians will again slow walk the admission that that is what has happened. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields. There's been fighting in other places. There was some sort of Ukrainian attack again in the Kremenaya, Svatovo region, at least according to Russian reports. Again, that attack was apparently repelled by the Russians, or so the Russians say, with heavy Ukrainian losses. And I gather that there continues to be a significant amount of fighting in Zaporozhye region. There's apparently a large concentration of Ukrainian troops north of Vuhledar, which is technically in the Donetsk Republic, but which is connected, if you like, to the situation in Zaporozhye region. And there's also a significant number of Ukrainian troops in Zaporozhye itself, and there are still some Russian commentators, quite a few actually, who believe that despite all that is happening in Bakhmut and in Soledar and in those sort of places, the Ukrainian leadership has still not given up on its plan for an offensive towards Melitopol from Zaporozhye, and that this offensive might also be directed towards Mariupol, important port town on the Sea of Azov that the Russians were able to capture earlier in the war. I ought to say that given the heavy Ukrainian losses in the Bakhmut area and the continued transfer of Ukrainian units from places like Zaporozhye to Bakhmut, it does seem that the Ukrainian forces that are in Zaporozhye and even in Vuhledar are dwindling in number and quality, and that there is increasing skepticism that such an offensive, were it ever launched, would have any real prospect of success. Anyway, that's the situation on the battle lines. Something else happened this morning. Yesterday, I read some reports talking about the fact that there'd been no big Russian missile strikes on Ukraine since the New Year period, the period directly after the New Year, when there was actually massive Russian missile strikes which persisted for several days. And again, that inevitably led to the reports and rumors and suggestions that the Russians had run out of missiles. Well, today, early this morning, there have been reports of another major Russian missile attack. And I read a report at one point that from a Ukrainian source that up to 17 Russian Tupolev 95 bombers and Tupolev 22 M3 bombers were in the air simultaneously launching missiles at Ukraine. And there were also reports, which I can't confirm, that Russian ballistic missiles were launched at Kiev itself, this time from the territory of Belarus. And again, I can't really say whether that is correct. Some of the reports spoke about the launch of these missiles having taken place from the north. There's some speculation that these were Iskander rocket systems that were brought into operation and are now launching missile strikes against Kiev and the surrounding area. A couple of weeks ago, there were rumors that the Russians were buying ballistic missiles from Iran. And perhaps these are the missiles that have been launched against Kiev. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not going to waste time speculating. But the point is, the argument that's been made is that for the moment, Ukrainian air defenses can shoot down the subsonic cruise missiles that the Russians continue to launch against Ukraine, the KH-101, the Kalibra missile, all of those sort of subsonic cruise missiles. They can also, of course, shoot down the Uranium-2 drones, which are not just subsonic, but propeller-driven and therefore relatively slow, even if they're also quite small. They're only comparatively small. But for the moment, Ukraine doesn't have the capability to defend against ballistic missiles. There's even some reports, though I wouldn't take these very seriously, that some of the missile strikes may have been carried out by hypersonic missiles. Presumably these would be Kinjal missiles launched from Belarus by the MiG-31 fighter jets that are based in Belarus. Well, as of the time of making this video, information about this missile strike is, to put it mildly, incredibly sketchy. I'm not going to discuss it further until I have more details. The one thing that is acknowledged from every source, and which has caused some surprise and anger, is that the Ukrainians this time were caught napping, that there were no air alerts across Ukraine as the Russian missiles closed in, and that the result was that the Ukrainian air defenses weren't operating properly, and people weren't warned in advance before these missiles struck. Of course, if some of these missiles are high-speed ballistic missiles, or indeed hypersonic missiles, the ones that hit Kiev, that might explain it, but we will just have to wait and see. At the moment, as I said, details of this missile strike are extremely sketchy, and we'll just have to wait and see what exactly has been taking place. One thing that has been interesting is that there are some rather intriguing reports about the air war, the war between Ukrainian and Russian fighter jets. Ukraine still manages to operate some sort of an air force. The Russians claim to have shot down very large numbers of Ukrainian aircraft and helicopters, but Ukraine is still able, from time to time, to send up fighter jets. I've noticed that increasingly these are MiG-29 fighter jets rather than the bigger and more powerful Sukhoi 27 fighter jets that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. I strongly suspect, though I cannot confirm, that some of these MiG-29 fighter jets are fighter jets supplied to Ukraine by NATO's former Warsaw Pact members, and that explains increasingly why we're seeing MiG-29s appearing in the Ukrainian Air Force instead of Sukhoi 27s. But anyway, put all that to one side. There's been an interview with some Ukrainian pilots, and they've been talking about the fact that they're now having increasing difficulties in face of missile intercepts by Russian R-37M air-to-air missiles. Now, the R-37M is an ultra-long-range missile. It's apparently got a range, an intercept range of something like 400 kilometers. It's a big missile, has a very, very long range. It's apparently a very powerful missile, and the Russians are increasingly using it to shoot down Ukrainian fighter jets, and Ukrainian fighter pilots are becoming increasingly nervous about this particular missile. And the question is, which aircraft, because this is an air-launched missile, which Russian aircraft are using this particular missile? Well, the R-37M can be launched by two types of Russian fighter jets. One are the MiG-31 fighter jets based, and of course, as we've discussed, the Russians have a significant number of these based in Belarus. It could be that it's these MiG-31 fighter jets in Belarus that are launching these R-37M missiles, which are shooting down these Ukrainian aircraft. But there is another possibility, another Russian aircraft that can launch R-37M missiles is the Sukhoi 57, which is, of course, Russia's fifth-generation fighter jet. And it seems that Russia now operates a small number of these fighter jets. Nobody seems to know the exact number. I've seen suggestions that it may be around 6. The British Ministry of Defence has admitted that Russia has operated the Sukhoi 57 in this conflict. Some time ago, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, in fact, confirmed as much. There's very, very little information as to what exactly it is that the Sukhoi 57 is doing in its operations over Ukraine. The British speculate that it remains, it flies only over Russian-controlled airspace. That is to say, Donbass, Zaporozhye. It doesn't operate deeply inside Ukraine, but it does have very powerful radars, more advanced radars than those of the MiG-31, and perhaps it is the Sukhoi 57 that is shooting down or has shot down some of these Ukrainian fighter jets. Why is that interesting? Well, only for this reason. If the Sukhoi 57 has indeed shot down some Ukrainian fighter jets, then to my knowledge, the best of my knowledge, that is the first time a fifth generation fighter has shot down the fighter jets of another country. The United States operates many more F-35 fifth generation, F-22 and F-35 fifth generation fighter jets than Russia does, and China is also bringing its fifth generation fighter, the J-20, into service in large numbers. The Russians have fewer of their equivalent fighter jet, fifth generation fighter jet, the Sukhoi 57, but it has carried out, or appears to have carried out, or perhaps has carried out, air-to-air interceptions, whereas the F-35 and the F-22 and the to the best of my, and of course the J-20, to the best of my knowledge, have not. Anyway, maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm sure if I am, I'm going to get a deluge of corrections. But if that's correct, if that's wrong, well, people are very welcome to correct me, and I'll be reading that with interest on the threads. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment with this battle. I don't want to spend too much time talking about fighter jets and what they're doing, but we can see that the situation for Ukraine in Donbass remains very bad. Bakhmut is now coming under pressure. Soledar has definitely fallen. Ukraine is suffering massive casualties in that area. And elsewhere, we see more Russian missile strikes in various places, in various parts of Ukraine. Now, there's been a whole string of commentaries about the course of this conflict at the moment. I understand that there's an article in the New York Times which links these latest deliveries of Western weapons, the Bradleys, the Marders, quite possibly the Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 tanks. And there are now rumours, by the way, that Germany and Britain are going to announce deliveries of these tanks to Ukraine next week. And it's been said that the West is rushing these weapon systems to Ukraine, these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks to Ukraine, in order to prepare Ukraine for this big Russian offensive that's expected in the next few weeks or months at the most. Well, I'm not sure when the Russians are going to launch their offensive. I've no doubt that an offensive is coming, but I don't know what the time frame is. But I'm going to make a, I think, fairly safe guess that the offensive is going to come well before these tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are ready for use by Ukraine. That's on the assumption that the Ukrainians need training to use them. These are complex vehicles. Again, Brian Baletic at the New Atlas is the expert on this sort of thing, but I doubt very much that the Ukrainians can simply walk into a Leopard 2 and operate it, even if they've had experience operating their own tanks, the T-64s and T-80s and those sort of tanks that Ukraine has been using up to now. They will need time to retrain in using these very complex Western tanks, which are very different from the kind of tanks they're accustomed to use, and that inevitably is going to take time. And as I understand it, effective use of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, and I suspect the Marder, is also going to take a long time. And of course, there is this question of whether use of these weapons, deployment of these weapons, is going to happen in anything like the quantities that Ukraine would need in order to make a real difference on the battlefield. I say that because I've been looking at the numbers of Leopard 2 tanks around the world, and it doesn't seem as if to me there are anywhere near enough to fill the kind of gaps that Ukraine needs, even if they get, say, 300 of them. I've read a study that says that the Ural Vagon Zavod factory in the Urals, in Nizhny Tagil, by contrast, has the capability to produce up to 1,000 tanks a year for the Russian army, and could be apparently geared up to do it reasonably fast. And contrary to what the particular article in which I read that claimed, Ural Vagon Zavod is not the only tank factory in Russia. There is also another significant tank factory in Omsk. Though it is smaller, it concentrated on producing T-80 tanks, which are the tanks with the gas turbine engines. It's more recently been refurbishing those tanks rather than making new ones, but perhaps it could also be committed to produce tanks as well if the need arose. Well, if Russia can produce 1,000 tanks a year, and given the very large stocks of tanks it already has, I've read a report that the numbers amount to something like 7,000. A couple of hundred Western tanks are going to be overwhelmed, even if it is the case that they are actually better than the Russian tanks. Perhaps they are, but there's not going to be anywhere near enough of them, or so it seems to me. Now, there's been lots of discussions, and Brian Baletic has done another outstanding video about this, about whether Western tanks really are better than Russian tanks, or are really indestructible tanks. It's been pointed out that the Leopard 2, for example, did not perform very well when used by the Turkish military in Syria a few years ago, that the Saudis have had problems operating the Leopard 2 and the Abrams tank, the American Abrams tank in Yemen, that Western tanks are far from indestructible, in other words, and I am sure that is right. And my guess is that the latest, the most modern Russian tank, which is now appearing on the Ukrainian battlefields, the T-90M, is probably at a technologically similar level to the Western tanks, and there's already said to be 200 of these in the conflict zone. And if Ural Vagon Zavod can really produce tanks at the rate of 1,000 a month, well, perhaps we'll be seeing more, no doubt we'll be seeing a lot more of them before very long. But anyway, my essential point is this. We're already seeing hundreds of thousands of Russian troops and hundreds of Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles being gathered around Ukraine's borders. And it's going to take months to get the Ukrainians up to the level where they're able to use these tanks, Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that they're now being provided, up to, if you like, an effective level of competence. Any suggestion that these tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, which are being supplied now to Ukraine, are really going to hold back this big Russian offensive, assuming it comes within the next few weeks or months, it's simply unrealistic. Again, I can't help but think that it's the kind of thing that civilian decision makers, politicians, who perhaps don't want to listen to the advice of their military people, might come up with. They might say to themselves, well, let's send tanks to Ukraine and that will stop the Russian offensive in its tracks, without really taking into account problems like logistics, problems like training to use these kind of machines. It's the kind of thing that civilian officials might be minded to do. And to be frank, I think that these deliveries are in far too small quantities and far too late to make any immediate difference to the cause of the war. We could be seeing these tanks appear on the battlefields by late spring, early summer, but by then, who knows what will have happened. Bakhmut, I would have thought by that point, for example, would definitely be lost. And even when they do appear, assuming that the war is still ongoing, which it presumably probably will be, it won't be, these tanks won't be coming in anything like the kind of numbers that would be needed to make a difference. And I should say that I've been looking at Russian Telegram channels, and there are already lots of discussions about the points of vulnerability of all of these Western machines. There's a big discussion in Russia about the most effective way to destroy these machines on the battlefield. So the Russians have been given lots of notice that they're coming, and they're preparing to deal with them. They don't seem to be awed or frightened by the fact that these tanks and machines are possibly on the way, or apparently on the way. Anyway, that now brings me to a number of further points, because there's been a number of comments, very interesting comments from a number of Western military officials. Firstly, a retired Bundeswehr general who has been described as an advisor to Angela Merkel has come forward and has said that he thinks that this whole conflict in Ukraine is wrong, that there's no clear plan in the West about how it ends. He's poured cold water on the idea that a couple of hundred tanks and infantry fighting vehicles from the West are going to make any difference to the course of the war. And he's also said that there's a real risk if the West continues to respond to every Russian advance and every Russian action in Ukraine by further escalating, that one day we could wake up and find ourselves in a World War III type situation. And this general has given this interview apparently to the German media. I don't know how much attention it's getting, but I suspect that it is going to crystallize debates that are already apparently now starting to surface in Germany. I saw an opinion poll about a week or 10 days ago from Germany, which showed that a plurality of Germans, 49%, opposed the transfer of Armada infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine against 40% who supported it, and a larger majority opposed transfer of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. There is also said to be now growing opposition to this idea of transferring Leopard 2 tanks and other weapon systems to Ukraine within the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which is the party of Chancellor Scholz and which is the party that ultimately formed the existing coalition. Now, this has been a slow burn thing, but I have to say, sooner or later, I have always wondered whether it might happen, because the great signature foreign policy achievement of the SPD since it first formed a government in Germany, West Germany as it then was, in the 1960s, was the policy of Ostpolitik, the engagement with Russia, the attempt to forge a stable, long-term relationship with Russia, started by the German Chancellor Willy Brandt, continued by his successor, Helmut Schmidt, taken much further by Gerhard Schröder in the 2000s, and of course also supported by CDU, the CDU Chancellor Helmut Kohl. And of course, Ostpolitik is widely credited with making possible the détente processes that began to take hold in Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, and which eventually led to the process of German reunification. Now, this conflict with Russia has seen the complete obliteration of Ostpolitik and all that it stood for. And I can't help but wonder whether there are people in the SPD who must be looking at this and asking themselves whether this is really wise, how has it been allowed to happen? And for all I know, some of them perhaps have picked up on these admissions by Angela Merkel, who, remember, is not a member of the SPD. She's a member of the CDU. She's the former leader of the CDU, the Conservative Party, right-wing party, which alternated with the SPD in forming governments in Germany. That beyond a certain point, the Germans themselves, Merkel at least, was not really looking to implement the Minsk agreement, pointing, in other words, to the fact that this collapse in the relationship with Russia has certain Western causes, or at least that Western leaders like Merkel have contributed, at the very least contributed to bringing it about. So I can't help but wonder whether, as I said, there are people in the SPD who must be asking themselves about this. And I understand that there's increasing numbers of people within the SPD who are complaining to Scholz about these arms deliveries and are making clear to him that they're very uneasy about what's happened, about the Marder transfer, and about the pending transfer of the Leopard 2s. So we may be starting to see some problems within the coalition. Having said that, it's important to say that the SPD is only one party in the German parliament, the Bundestag, and the other three parties, the big parties, the big establishment parties, the CDU, CSU, the Free Democrats, and of course the Greens, remain fervently committed to the policy of supporting Ukraine. Problem is that there's now further signs that other elements of German society is starting to become increasingly uneasy. And I've seen reports, I can't confirm these, but they come from German sources, that there's now real unease within the German business community about the direction of German foreign policy, not just towards Russia, where German business has lost both its access to cheap Russian energy and also its long-standing market position, but perhaps even more importantly, that there is now concern that the German foreign ministry led by the Green politician Annalena Baerbock, is now looking for a rupture in Germany's relations with China. And these are much more important for the German business community, at least in terms of the market that they provide, even than the relationship with Russia. And there's stories now circulating that the business leaders have now finally put their foot down and are telling Scholz that they are not happy at all with about any possible rupture with China, and that they're starting to push back. And allegedly, a German foreign ministry document, a policy document prepared under Baerbock's direction, which is seeking to take a much more critical position in Germany's relations with China. Apparently, it's been delayed because of this opposition from the German business community. Now, what does this have to do with Ukraine? I think the short answer is that if the business community, the German business community, is now starting to push back on policy with respect to China, then I suspect it is only a matter of time before they start becoming much more critical about the way in which policy towards Russia has been conducted as well. And if, of course, there's a debacle in Ukraine, as is increasingly looking likely, well, I think that criticism will mount and will become very powerful. So, arguments and disputes in Germany. One German military official, senior German military official, very unhappy with the direction things are taking, saying that supplies of Leopard 2s and Marders really isn't going to achieve anything. It's just dangerous tokenism. It's not going to help Ukraine. It's going to lead to more defeats for Ukraine and more concerns, more pushback, certainly I suspect from the SPD or members of the SPD, possibly from German business as well. But that's overshadowed, or so it seems to me, by some criticisms that have now come from within the United States. Firstly, we've had a statement from Admiral Daryl Cordell, commander of the US Fleet Forces Command, that the United States Navy may, within about 6 months, 6 to 12 months, have to make a decision whether between arming itself or arming Ukraine. And that's now been followed up by further comments from US Navy Secretary Carlos de Toro, and he's essentially saying much the same thing. And he's saying that, we're not yet in a disastrous position. He says that, we're still able to hold things together. But he has said if the conflict does go on for another 6 months to another year, it certainly continues to stress the supply chain of weapons for the US Navy in ways that are challenging. Now, that's been a little bit of a surprise because most of the weapons we've been hearing about that have been going to Ukraine, which have been coming out of US military stocks, seem to be more oriented towards the military, but we've been seeing some Sea Sparrow missiles ending up in Ukraine, Harpoon missiles, I suspect the major concern is about Patriot missile systems. And I suspect that the Navy has not been happy about the transfer of the Patriot battery to Ukraine, not because, as I understand it, the Navy itself operates Patriot systems, but because Patriot systems are needed in the Pacific in order to provide the missile shield within which the Navy itself must to some extent operate. I say that obviously the Navy has enormous air defense capabilities of its own, but Patriot missiles are necessary or said to be necessary in the Pacific area as well. But the point is, we're now getting open criticism of this policy of arming Ukraine, even if it's very subdued criticism for the moment, from serving US military officials, the Navy Secretary and the head of the US Navy Command. Now, this isn't an open mutiny or anything like that, but I suspect that they're articulating growing concerns that more and more people within the Pentagon are having, that just as Ukraine has overcommitted resources to the defense of Soledar and Bakhmut, the United States is overcommitting resources to the defense of Ukraine. And just as Soledar and eventually Bakhmut will fall to the Russians, I suspect that some of these military officials are saying, what is the point of sending all these weapons to Ukraine when the Russians are going to win in Ukraine eventually anyway? We are simply depleting our own arsenals, weakening our overall military position to no eventual useful purpose. And some of these officers, and especially naval officers, one suspects, they are probably saying anyway, look, our proper emphasis shouldn't be Ukraine anyway. This is a sideshow. Russia is a problem, but it's not our major adversary. Our major adversary, the country with which we might potentially find ourselves in a direct conflict over Taiwan and over the South China Sea, is of course China. And we're weakening our overall defenses, depleting our arms stocks, despite the fact that this conflict with China is on the way, and the Chinese are building up their forces, and instead of building up our forces, we are instead depleting them. Now, this is, as I said, the first public criticisms of the policy of supporting Ukraine coming from US serving members of the US military, a civilian official, Secretary Del Toro, and a military official, Admiral Caudle. Well, as I said, it's not a mutiny. They're not saying at the moment that this should stop. I wonder how much longer it will be, however, before criticism of this kind becomes not just public, but stronger. Anyway, I suspect that we're starting to see increasing doubts expressed by the military in Germany. And by the way, I think a retired German general is almost certainly not just speaking for himself. He's probably articulating growing doubts within the German military establishment as well. And certainly I don't think the Navy is speaking out in the United States without some support from other figures within the Pentagon also. Anyway, I suspect that all these doubts over the next few weeks and months are going to grow, and they're going to start to become more public. I've also said, of course, that we're going to see a political crisis in the United States, and I've already said that the appointment of special counsel to investigate President Biden's handling of classified documents after he ceased to be vice president, well, that's going to inevitably, it seems to me, complicate political decision making even more. I think I've made my feelings about the course of this Ukraine war very clear many times. I think the time has come, it is long overdue, for some kind of negotiation to begin. I think that whatever the problems Ukraine has in conducting negotiations with the Russians, the debacle in Bakhmut should concentrate minds in Kiev. Whether it will is another matter. And I think Ukrainians perhaps ought to be paying some attention to these comments that are coming out of Germany and the United States, and should realize that the conveyor belt of Western weapons that has been sending weapons to Ukraine may not be unlimited. Anyway, this has been a long video. This is where I stop. Just to remind you, you can find all our videos on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop and find yourself the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. More information, no doubt, tomorrow about the latest Russian missile strike. And I'll keep you informed about latest events. Thank you for joining me again today. And as I said, have a very good day.